Welcome to the New Future of Work, the series brought to you by Harvey Nash and Spinks, where we explore, along with technology leaders, business leaders and talent leaders, how everyone is coping with the current crisis and what work might look like when we get back to normal. In today's episode, we're asking how the customer landscape is changing. And to answer that question, I'm joined by three guests. David Yousefnia, he's an organisational psychologist, advisor and founder. Olivier Stapylton-Smith, who is the co-founder of the company Moteefe, and Kerry Sinclair, who is EVP of IT at Sage. So welcome to today's conversation. It's all about the changing customer landscape. Customers are obviously all over the world, so it's great to be joined by a panel that is based in both the UK and in the States. So thank you for that. And being biased as well, Kerry is based in the northeast of England, which is possibly where people have the most sense in the world. I'm a native in Newcastle, so I have to be profoundly biased on that point. I won't come to Kerry first. I will come to you, Olivier, in London, just to ask the first question about whether or not we should view the current changes in customer behaviour as an acceleration of the direction we were already heading in, or more of a profound shift in behaviour that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I think this is really an acceleration of the shifts that we were already seeing, the biggest one being obviously a lot of the transactions just moving online and people becoming a lot more comfortable with buying online. I know my grandmother, for the first time ever, has bought something online in the last 2 months. So this is really just a continuation of what we're seeing there. And I think that's massively going to accelerate. If we get rid of, the short-term shocks in terms of COVID-19, then I don't think there's going to be any massive change in customer behaviour. So it's all about online. Businesses need to be very radical in this, and if they want to survive, then they're going to have to adapt to that.
Is there a bit of a difference between B2b and B2c here? I mean, Kerry, I know when we were talking earlier today with regards to Sage, you're obviously dealing with small businesses, whereas I can imagine the consumer it is probably a bit of an acceleration. There's that instant gratification we want and the delivery through the door. There is something a bit more around values when it comes to B2B partnerships, right? There's always been that thing of whether or not you're working with a customer who shares your values. So do you think people are going to look for businesses who live their values and share the same values that they do, more so than they did before the crisis?
I do, actually. And interestingly, over this pandemic, I think social media has helped amplify brands and values that particularly haven't actually led, using them, whether that's billionaires trying to claim furlough for some of their employees. As you will all recognise some of the big cases that have been being tweeted around and on social media. But I actually think that, businesses that have gone to help their customers accelerate towards digitalisation of their business processes or how they interact with their own employees in the workplace, especially in this home working environment, are equally as important. Whether that's helping employees get their pay slip online or book a holiday or, flag that they need some time out. There's got to be mechanisms for that. And obviously digital platforms are there to help engage in making sure that people can keep in touch with their workforce as well as their customers.
Just out of interest, I'll probably bring David in at this point because you're an organisational psychologist, right? I mean, were organisations ready? I mean, I often think that organisations were ready with these processes that Kerry's describing in place, but maybe they weren't. I mean, some organisations seem to have taken to this a lot more easily than others, right?
Yeah. I think there's some companies that just were prepared at priming the pump to embrace work from home and a remote and distributed teams. And this just kind of, this pandemic just basically was a fast forward button and everyone's been forced to do it. But there are some kind of positive aspects that might come out of this as well from a talent perspective. If your company is now fully work from home or is embracing a more distributed setup, you now have access to a much wider talent pool. You may not be tied to geography, so you could pull in someone from a different state, region, or country, and the expected behaviors of working remotely are going to be more accessible to.
I'd probably pick up on something that Kerry said around. Well, you mentioned social media. Olivier, your business very, very much deals in that kind of arena. And I suppose you would make the point that personalization is becoming more and more important. And I suppose then data is going to be key to that. Are customers going to have a greater ability to drive their own online experience, or are they going to be largely at the whim of tech organizations?
No, I think if you're not trying to tailor the experience to each individual customer, then I think you're doing something wrong. I think that's going to become more and more important. What social media enables you to do is choose the traffic and the personality of the person. So each landing page that you create is tailored to that particular customer, for example. And that's one of the big shifts, going from offline to online. That just enables you to tailor a bit more the experience. So everything will be a lot more personalized to each customer. One of the things that we've seen over the last sort of 2 years has been really an increase in the number of people who are creating personalized goods online. So we do it on our platform. And it was about 10% 2 years ago of our volume, and now it's about 50% of our sales. So you're really seeing that shift sort of in people wanting something tailored to them and a product that is unique for them. So all that's happening right now is, as everything's moving online, I think companies have the ability to tailor the experience, and so not doing so, it's going to be really missing a beat.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think what's going to be fascinating is how companies behave with that data, right? So we, again, probably all seen in the media when that happens negatively. So the trust and the relationship with the brand and what you offer up to get that personalization as a consumer of maybe something like Facebook versus how you do that in business, that can be quite a different exchange. So I think how brands align the trust that they give to their customers ultimately to be able to deliver that experience, because the type of data that you need to be able to do that very well can often be handled in a negative way if you don't get that right. So I think how brands behave in a digital world is really important with that trust dynamic in there.
Sorry, just to jump in, how are you working with your businesses at the moment, with your customers? Because they are small businesses, right? And I suppose there will be that temptation at the minute to sell a little bit more to them. A lot of them are thinking about cloud services because they were using desktop options and they're going through that digitization themselves. It must be really tempting to sell a little bit more, right?
Yeah, it would be, but we've chosen not to, right? So for us, new customer acquisition at this moment in time is probably the wrong thing to be trying to do, unless customers obviously are in the market for us to work with and maybe want to buy something. But we've pivoted our business in the last weeks and months with helping small businesses work through the processes and the support on offer to them. So we're a global business, and as you've seen, most countries have got their own mechanism for funding to help small businesses. So we've pivoted ours to be working out how we can get smaller companies access to that, direct them through what are often quite complex government processes. And we've moved our whole of our sage.com website ultimately to direct people to support, instead of trying to work out how we can get them the best out of their tools. Of course, in each geography, we supply payroll products, etc. And most countries are now paying people on these schemes. So in the UK, for example, we've been working with HMRC to write a module that helps customers work through how the furlough scheme is going to work, how to process that payroll, etc. So we've changed the dynamic of our business to be a support business ultimately. And at the end of this, hopefully they'll come back to us and remember that we did that to support them through the difficult times. So that trust and loyalty piece of the brand is very important to us. It's one of our values that we want our customers to be successful. So that's what, we're being led by our values at this point in time.
David, are you keen to make a point there?
Yeah. Just to kind of piggyback on this notion of trust between the brand and the customer. The other side of the coin on brand on the brand is the culture internally within the company, and we're going to start to see employers needing to kind of build and encourage a culture of trust with their employees as we come back to work, as the stay-at-home edicts are lifted. Employees will need to trust their employers to have their best interest at heart, whether it's financially, health-wise, safety-wise, and we're going to start to see this notion of psychological safety come up, where people feel safe enough to be at work both physically and emotionally, and I think that will start to bubble up a lot more in the workplace too.
I mean, just on that point, right? Going remote has been, as we were saying at the top of this piece, quite easy for some organisations.
Yep.
Might be arguably harder now to go back, right? So how do companies go about seeking to address the concerns of their employees? I live and work in central London. I'll be perfectly frank. I don't really fancy getting on the tube. Right.
And so I think in the same way we talked about kind of customizing the customer experience and from a digital aspect, and employers will need to be really flexible and customize the work experience for employees coming back. Some people, there's already data bubbling up. The younger employees look at work as part of where they have a lot of their social interactions. So if they're living at home and not having that interaction at work, that's going to be something for them that they would need to get used to or figure out. But also the commute, right? So some people drive, some people may not feel comfortable taking the train in during peak hours. So being flexible with how people come into work, or creating kind of these hybrid schedules where some teams are in on some days, other teams come in on other days too. So there's going to be a lot of kind of customization happening. And with that, a lot of communication two ways between leaders and managers and employees to hear what they want and are requesting what works for them. And on the other way too, for employees to communicate their concerns to managers and their leaders.
Kerry, I suppose you're in a slightly interesting position because, as you mentioned, you're a global business, right? You've got teams in geographies all around the world where the wave is of this pandemic is at different stages. So you've got the benefit of seeing what's happened on the ground ahead of where we are in the UK and taking lessons from that. And I suppose it gets harder with each cycle to necessarily listen to a local government when you've got yourself learnings from what might have happened in other countries.
That's absolutely right. So what we did on the exit of the offices is we were taking notice of what was happening in every geography and moving with it. But as we go back to the office, and it's really interesting that you talked about going back. We decided to say go back to the office, not back to work, because we're all working, right? So we're trying to get our language really right on this, because it's really important that, we're all being pretty effective today working from home. So we're taking exactly that stance, really. We've got this thing called Always On Listening, which is a really simple survey. And the people can go in and, within the few clicks of a survey, tell us how they're feeling every day, every hour, if they wanted to. And we're keeping a constant pulse check and watching that change around the world as well. And we're using exactly what you've just described, sort of looking at each geography. Do we need to do anything different based on where they are in the cycle of the pandemic? And actually not making any blanket decisions. We've got some people living in London and bed sits, and working off the end of their beds who maybe need something very different to maybe like myself. I've got great office space to work in. So we're trying to prioritize and help people as individuals work through it. And different geographies have different challenges with that. So we're not making a big blanket decision that the offices will reopen on a certain day because the lockdown's being lifted. We're taking a really, really slow, thoughtful approach to it. And again, based on what you've just described, trust is really important. The well-being of our colleagues is our number one driver for that, and making sure that they feel supported by us. That's a very important factor for us.
Just, Olivier, I might throw this at you, and I apologise because it's probably one of the harder questions I've got. But whilst we're talking about trust and we're talking about the changing customer landscape, Amazon are making a bit of a killing at the minute. I think last month it was reported they were making something like $11,000 a second, just obscene amounts of money. And a lot of people feel that they don't have a lot of choice online. A lot of people feel that there needs to be greater governance of technology businesses. With governments bailing out a lot of technology firms with furlough schemes and whatever else, is there an opportunity here for a little bit more governance and a little bit of, to seek to readdress rather the balance and make sure that companies do actually have the customers, the consumers' best interests at heart rather than margins and bottom lines?
That's a very broad question. Thank you for asking. No, I think it's really interesting. I think Kerry, you had more of a B2B angle there in terms of living the values. I think in terms of B2C, which is more how I look at the world. I've seen a surge in transactional relationships, effectively, where the consumer is just looking for convenience, and Amazon is not embodying the values of the average UK or I imagine even US consumer, but they are just super convenient. And you're going to find the product that you're looking for. It's going to be cheap to ship. It's going to be the cheapest price, and you're going to get it in 2 days. Okay, great. I'm going to go with Amazon. And so, do you need more governance to regulate that convenience? That's going to be a really hard call to make for any government, because at the end of the day, they are offering the best service that they possibly can to consumers. And I think Amazon, core to their values is actually the customer does come first. To the big, and after employees, right? So we've seen employees maybe at Amazon struggling through this crisis, but the consumer was obviously happy to get their products just a few days later. So I'm not sure, with e-commerce and online business, that more regulation is necessarily going to be the way forward. And I think small businesses just need to adapt, and there's so many different ways that you can offer a great service online. That I think that's really the approach that businesses need to take now.
I think there might be an interesting theme there around, the customer comes first for Amazon ahead of possibly even its employees. David, you were talking earlier about a culture of trust, and we all are now in a slightly odd scenario where possibly a lot of us need that stability, right? It's a very uncertain time for people on 0-hour contracts and the gig workers, but for those of us who are lucky to supposed to be in white collar jobs and working from home, well, just working, as Joe makes, we're not necessarily working from home, we are just working, but we might hang on to our jobs a little bit more closely than we used to because we need to feel part of something. And I suppose changing right now must be very scary for some people.
Right. So there's a few factors that are at play here. You typically look at why people stay or leave, right? It's how connected or how engaged they feel to an organization. That's probably the biggest predictor of whether or not someone will leave the organization. But that strength of that relationship is also kind of moderated by unemployment rates. So when unemployment rates go up, people will stay in place longer because they have fewer economic options for them to consider. There are fewer jobs for them to leave to. And so, if you're looking at just from like a retention standpoint, we'll probably see turnover rates kind of calm down a bit. But you also want people who are there to be engaged. You want them to go above and beyond. You want them to show up every day. You want them to, exceed the customer's needs and requests. And one of the biggest drivers of that is the manager, right? So managers account for a really big component of how engaged your people are. And I think what we'll start to see is a shift in emphasis on those specific manager skills that aren't they're more the people skills, right? They aren't the technical skills of being a manager in engineering or in IT or in sales to help someone understand how to do their job. It's going to be more around engendering trust, being a good communicator, and having the ability to empathize with each of your employees. And those skills, I think, are going to become even more important in a world where most teams are going to be working remotely or working from home, or they're going to be split up between the office and outside the office. So I think we'll start to see a greater emphasis on making sure companies have great managers as we continue on.
Something I'd be really fascinated to see what your view is on this, David. Something I'm kind of struggling with is whether or not this is going to empower more junior staff within an organization or not, because there's part of me that wonders if it'll help self-regulation. On the one hand, maybe junior staff or less experienced staff are going to be really desperate to cling onto their jobs, and maybe they're going to be more compromising and willing to accept conditions they wouldn't have accepted before, versus their managers are going to have to do a much better job engaging with them, so therefore the junior staff have more of a voice. And I can't really work out which side of that is.
You could go either way, but I think I'm hoping it'll go in a way where people will be more empowered and not feel like they're kind of pushed in a corner or being managed by fear tactics. And I think that becomes a lot harder, because when you think about meetings, right, like a Zoom meeting where you might have 4, 5, 6, 10 people in the room virtually, it almost democratizes the communication, right? You're not deferring just to the manager. Anyone can potentially speak up. There'll be more forms of digital communication happening. So I think what we'll start to see, if there is a manager that doesn't manage appropriately, that will show up quicker in the organization, and whether it's the team's performance or patterns of communication or what have you.
Sorry, Olivier, you were keen to come in.
Yeah, I think we're at scale up stage, so we've got about 100 people in the company, so it's a relatively flat hierarchy anyway. But what I've seen is literally the organization of the company just becoming even flatter, with everyone being able to talk to each other. So definitely sort of what David is saying resonates very, very loudly at Moteefe, and we're seeing interns sort of speaking to the CEO, which wouldn't have happened before, just because they would never be in the same rooms, and we just wouldn't foster sort of those conversations. So this I think is going to be extremely empowering for the more junior members of any team, and I think something to be encouraged.
Kerry, is that something? I mean, you're in a very different position to Olivier's business.
So definitely. So we've got 13,000 colleagues around the world, and we hold a Sage TV thing where everybody dials in, and just our CEO doing that from home, and everybody being really interested in what's going on behind them has made the relationship really fundamentally different. People asking him questions about his lamp, and it's just fundamentally changed the dynamic. But one of the things that we talked about is we have a lot of cross-country meetings, and often, say I'm in the UK and I've got 4 or 5 team members with me, and 4 or 5 people are dialed in around the world. What you'll find by naturally is the more people in the room with you tend to get more voice in the meeting. And actually what we found is our meetings have been much more effective where everybody's been dialed in, because everybody's more conscious of that and everybody's had a voice. And if you lead well, then everybody gets a chance to engage with that. Conversely, and I think it was the point we were making before, poor managers actually are amplified significantly in this environment. So my always on survey tells me where I've got challenge, because my colleagues are telling me that there's a challenge, whether that's not being flexible enough or feel like they're checking up on people and people are not feeling trusted. So I think that there is definitely a dynamic to that leadership piece. But for us, I'm hoping our colleagues around the world are feeling more empowered. It's certainly what we're hearing. And we're trying to not be task focused. I think we touched on this before, let's just set weekly goals, monthly goals. We're not going to micromanage what hours of the day you work. We're not going to be checking in every other hour to see if you've done it. We're setting goals up, make sure that they're outcome based, and letting people work through how to deliver them. And that makes them feel empowered and accountable in a different way. So it's been quite enlightening for us, I would say.
David, I'd come to you. I know that you're keen to to build on the points that are being made there. I'd also ask you as well an additional question on top of the point you're about to make, because we're hearing lots of positives here, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
We want to hear positives, but at the same time, we're on another Zoom meeting, right? There's been a lot of Zoom meetings, and we're not really wired to operate this way long term. So first of all, please do jump in and make the point you were going to make. But if you could,
sure,
you could turn
for sure.
as well.
Just on Kerry's comment of like not being task focused and focusing on the goals, I think that's going to be the way to manage, because you can't look over someone's shoulder when you're in different offices or the team's distributed, and you're going to have to create clear goals and objectives for your team and manage to those goals and say, okay, it's Monday. What are your goals for this week, this sprint, this month? And then we'll check in on them. And if you're blocked, come in and I'll help unblock you. I'll help you, achieve those goals. And being able to, you give people a sense of autonomy is going to be really important too. And then Dave, your question is around the kind of.
Well, I suppose the long-term psychological effects. We're talking about a lot of the positives, and we're talking about how to manage people immediately. But I'd be interested from a psychology point of view. I think this might play out because I'm finding it fine at the minute. I'll be perfectly honest. I can do my job remotely quite easily, but I do miss people.
Right. We all miss people. And our brains aren't wired to communicate just through Zoom. Right. It's very, we don't read people. There's delays. There's lags, and people want that. There's a certain amount of uncertainty that your brain requires when communicating, and it keeps you thinking more. There's also just this notion of connecting with people. And when you're in the same office, you have the opportunity to just bump into someone, getting a cup of tea or grabbing a snack or going in and out of the office. And those little connection points create what we sometimes call collisions at work. And those collisions at work are what leads to feelings of kind of affiliating with the company and feeling engaged with the company. But also there's a bunch of research out there that says these collisions of work lead to new ideas and innovation. So I think one of the downsides of this, if we don't get all back into a physical space in the long term, is people will feel less connected at work, and innovation might suffer too, because you aren't exchanging these ideas kind of almost randomly. It's kind of, there's lots of different analogies that you could make around this, but at the end of the day, I think it's people want to be connected, and they like to do so in person.
Just as a last point, and I suppose it loosely ties to the innovation piece, we're suddenly very dependent on tools like Zoom and Teams, and we've had to fast forward the development of some of those tools. So Teams has now introduced gallery view, so that you can see more than just a small number of faces on a screen, and kind of try and compete with Zoom in that space. And I suppose there's a bit of innovation that's been forced by the current situation that maybe might not have happened until further down the line. What other tools are there out there? I mean, Kerry, I know that you're looking at this in terms of well-being and health. You were talking about the need not to over-collaborate.
Yeah. So what happened when we first all got home to work, if you like, is everybody felt that they needed to connect with everybody every minute of every day. And the people quickly told us that the alerts from all of these chat groups and Teams groups were becoming very distracting. So what we've tried to do is create sort of collaboration rooms where people can pop in and pop out of, using that technology. But also things like health and well-being, I think you were talking before, we're very human relationship animals, right? So it's really important that we look after ourselves in mind and body. So we've been doing things like that. We've got a charity that we run, Sage Foundation. So we've been trying to give people different meanings to come together. We've had loads of virtual hookups where we've been doing, things for local charities and various things, so people can feel like they're giving back as well for that emotional well-being. So we've got lots of different things going on, but ultimately it's making sure that there's the right communities for people to reach out to when they need them. But ultimately it's about collaboration and people feeling that they've got them places to still go. So, our Spanish team were the first team to start the 5 o'clock drinking meeting, having a glass of wine together at the end of the week. And that followed suit around the world quite quickly. So people are still finding the moments, just in a different way. I believe once lockdown's out, and people can get a little bit more interaction outside of work, it will help us at the moment because we're not getting much interaction outside of work either, other than within our immediate people and family, etc. It feels more difficult. But the more things loosen around that, I think it will really help people.
Just quickly before we wrap up, David, Olivier, any other tools or platforms that you've seen that you think are quite interesting that maybe we might not have seen otherwise?
That's no specific tools themselves, but I do start to see people not scheduling a Zoom call and doing it by phone. And they're, because of the fatigue of so many back-to-back video calls. And when you think it's actually kind of nice to talk to someone on the phone. And so I think you'll start to see people regulate how much time they spend on Zoom and Slack and Teams versus more traditional. I don't think the fax machine's coming back, but
the novelty of the phone call.
Yeah.
No, I think what's going to be really, really important is to be able, even if the relationship is more online, to get feedback from customers. So, using tools like Hotjar to see how people are interacting with your website, or Qualtrics to get sort of really customer feedback. That's going to be really, really important. And probably people weren't doing it enough before, but now even more, both in B2B and B2C, it's going to be extremely important to get that feedback from customer when some of the more regular channels that we used to have don't exist anymore. So we're going to have to adapt to that.
Look, I think that brings us to the end of today's conversation. It's been a fascinating chat. If you want to dive more deeply into this particular conversation, James Lawson, one of the directors at the Harvey Nash Group, hosts a parallel podcast series, the Future of Work series, where we are diving into a few more of these subjects in a little bit more forensic detail. So do look out for that. And we are releasing all of these episodes at once, so you can binge on them Netflix style. So if this is the first one that you've seen, there are 4 more that you can go and watch immediately. I want to thank YouHubs for hosting today's today's conversation rather. They're a live remote masterclass platform. Loads of global experts. Go check out their website. Thank you for being our host for today. And lastly, Olivier, David, and Kerry, thank you very much for being our guests and offering such useful and interesting insight.